My name is Thomas Reffert. I was 22 years old, 3 weeks into my post as a junior gate clerk at Windsor Castle, and I had not yet learned that the most dangerous men in the world are the ones who do not look dangerous at all. It was the second Tuesday in November. The fog had come down in the night and had not lifted. The gas lamps along the trade gate were still burning at 6:45 in the morning, soft yellow against the gray, and the cobblestones were dark with damp. I remember the cold on the back of my neck. I remember the smell of coal smoke from the kitchens behind me. I remember my hands were inside my coat pockets because I had forgotten my gloves at the boarding house and was too proud to mention it. The trade gate is not the gate people photograph. It is the side service entrance, narrow, plain, set into the east wall where the delivery vans come in before the household wakes. There is a small guardhouse to one side with a window that looks out over the approach. That morning I was in the guardhouse, standing at the window with my logbook open on the ledge, watching the fog and waiting for the morning shift to come on. Sergeant Major Ian Bremner was at the post. Bremner had served 26 years. He was a short man, narrow through the shoulders, with gray at his temples and a quietness about him that I had not yet learned to read. In my first week, he had spoken perhaps 40 words to me in total. In my second week, I had begun to notice that the other guards, even the senior ones, lowered their voices slightly when he was nearby. By my third week, I had started watching him the way you watch a clock you do not yet know how to wind. At 6:47, I saw a figure coming up the approach road. He came out of the fog the way a photograph develops in a tray, first a shape, then a coat, then the buttons, then the face. He was a tall man, perhaps 50, with a clean gray mustache and the bearing of someone who had walked into important buildings all his life. He wore the dark uniform of a Metropolitan Police inspector. The cap sat correctly. The greatcoat was buttoned to the throat. A leather document case hung from his left hand, the kind with brass corners and a small lock. His right hand was empty and relaxed at his side. He was smiling slightly, not at anyone, just smiling the way a man smiles when he is comfortable. I looked at Bremner. Bremner had gone still. I do not know how to describe it except to say that the sergeant major, who was already a quiet man, became quieter. His shoulders did not move. His breath did not show in the cold air the way mine did. He was watching the man approach, and he had become the gate itself, a piece of the wall, a thing that did not flinch. I had not yet learned what that stillness meant. I picked up my pen. I opened my logbook to a fresh page. I wrote down the time. I wrote down the weather. I wrote down that a visitor was approaching. My hand was steady because I did not yet know to be afraid. A robin landed on the top of the gate post. It was a small brown bird with a red breast, and it cocked its head and looked at the man coming up the road, and then it looked at Bremner, and then it began to preen one wing. I noticed it because it was the only thing moving in a world that had stopped. The man in the inspector's uniform reached the gate. He stopped at the proper distance. He gave Bremner a small nod, the kind of nod one professional gives another. He spoke in a voice that was warm and educated and entirely at ease. "Good morning, Sergeant Major. Inspector Edward Calloway, Metropolitan Police. I've a briefing scheduled with the head of household at 0700. Apologies for the early hour." Bremner did not move for a long moment. Then he said very pleasantly, "Good morning, sir." That was all. The man called Calloway waited, the small smile still on his face, and when nothing more came, he reached inside his greatcoat with a practiced motion and produced a leather wallet. He flipped it open. A warrant card, a photograph, a name. He held it up at the correct height for Bremner to read without leaning forward. Bremner looked at it. Bremner did not take it. "Lance Corporal Pike," Bremner said, without turning his head. Daniel Pike had come up from the gatehouse behind. He was 24, broad in the chest, only 9 months in the role and still keen as a new blade. He stepped forward smartly. "Sergeant Major, Inspector Calloway has a document case." Would you ask him very politely if he'd mind setting it down on the bench, just there, while we sort out the paperwork? Sergeant Major. Pike turned to the visitor. He was about to speak. I saw his hand begin to move toward the gate latch. Only an inch, only the start of a motion. The kind a young man makes when he has already decided in his head that a thing is fine. Bremner said Pike. Just the name, soft, almost friendly. Pike's hand stopped. I saw the back of Pike's neck go red above his collar. He had not realized what he was doing. He stepped back a pace. He gestured to the bench beside the guardhouse wall. He said, "If you wouldn't mind, sir." The man called Calloway set the document case on the bench. He did it slowly and without any sign of being troubled. He kept the small smile. "Of course," he said, "of course." Bremner stepped forward then, only one pace, but that one pace put him squarely in the line between the gate and the visitor, and I noticed it, and I do not think the visitor did. "Filthy morning for it, sir," Bremner said, "all the way up from town." "Pimlico," said Calloway, "left at 5, roads were quiet." "Pimlico," Bremner nodded slowly as if working something out. "My sister-in-law's in Pimlico, Lupus Street. Do you know it?" "I know it well. Bakery on the corner, Polish family, open at 4 every morning." "That's the one," said Calloway, smiling more broadly. "Wonderful rye bread." Bremner smiled back. "I was watching from the window, and I did not know yet that there is no bakery on the corner of Lupus Street. I did not know that Bremner had no sister-in-law. I would not know either of these things for another 6 hours, when I would hear him say so to the inspector from Thames Valley over a cup of tea in the guardroom." But the robin on the gate post stopped preening and looked at the visitor again, and the visitor's right hand came up and adjusted his cuff. A small motion, a neat motion, the kind of motion a man makes when he wants something to do with his hands. Bremner saw it. Bremner did not react to seeing it. "Inspector," he said, "would you happen to have the briefing request paperwork? Just for the log, you know how it is." "Of course." Calloway reached again inside the greatcoat. He produced a folded letter on Metropolitan Police letterhead, the seal broken, the creases sharp. He handed it across. Bremner took it this time. He read it without hurry. He held it up to the light of the gas lamp. He read it again. It was a perfect letter. I would see it later. The letterhead was correct. The signatures were correct. The reference numbers were in the proper format. The request was for an urgent security briefing with the castle's head of household regarding a matter of operational sensitivity that could not be discussed at distance. It was signed by a real chief superintendent at a real station, and the chief superintendent in question was, at that very moment, asleep in his bed in Croydon, and would not learn until lunchtime that his name had been used. Bremner folded the letter. He handed it back. "Very good, sir. And which of my colleagues at the household signed off the access?" "Mr. Harding." "Mr. Harding?" "Yes." "Inside the household?" "Yes." Bremner nodded. He looked thoughtful. He looked, in fact, like a man who had just been given an answer that satisfied him completely. A few feet away, on the gate post, the robin opened its wings and resettled them. "That's grand," said Bremner. "Mr. Harding will be expecting you then. Pike, would you nip into the guardhouse and put the kettle on? Inspector, you'll have a cup before you go up. It's bitter out here." "Very kind." "Refford." I jumped. I had not expected my name. "Sergeant Major." "2 sugars in mine, lad. None for the inspector. Inspector, am I right?" Calloway laughed lightly. "How did you know?" "You look like a man who watches his health, sir." "You have a good eye, Sergeant Major." "I try, sir, I try." I went into the guardhouse. I filled the kettle from the small tap by the door. I set it on the gas ring. My hand was beginning to shake now, although I did not know why. The conversation outside continued. Bremner asked about the inspector's drive. Calloway answered easily. Bremner asked whether the new traffic scheme on the A308 had eased things or made them worse. Calloway said it had made them rather worse, if he were honest. Bremner laughed and said that was always the way, wasn't it? I lit the gas. I set out 3 mugs. I listened. I was not yet aware that Bremner had asked 4 questions about a route and had received 4 answers that were all correct in the way a man might be correct if he had memorized a map, but had not driven the road. The phrasing was wrong. The little complaints were wrong. The mention of the bridge at Staines was wrong, because there was road work on that bridge that anyone who had driven through that morning would have mentioned without prompting. I was 22 years old. I was making tea. Outside, the robin flew away. Bremner glanced down, only once, only briefly, at the visitor's boots. I saw it through the window. I did not understand it. The boots were polished. They were polished to a very high shine. They were the boots of a man who had brushed them carefully that morning in front of a mirror. They were beautiful boots. They were the wrong boots. A Metropolitan Police inspector who came to Windsor on official business by car wore regulation duty boots with a very particular wear pattern at the heel from the radio car pedals, a narrow scuff along the outer edge of the right heel, a matching one slightly higher on the left from clutch work in older vehicles, and a faint cross-hatching from the rubber matting on the driver's side floor. Every officer Bremner had ever admitted to that gate in 26 years had carried that wear pattern on his boots, because every officer had driven himself or been driven in a car with that matting. The boots in front of Bremner had no such wear. They had been polished to civilian standard. They were a gentleman's boots, beautifully kept, and they had never sat on a police car's pedals in their life. Bremner looked up. He smiled. "Inspector," he said, "one last thing for the log, and then we'll get you up to the house. Could you give me the call sign of the unit you came up with this morning? Just standard, you understand." There was the smallest pause. It was so small that I, in the guardhouse, did not catch it. I only know about it because Pike told me later that he had heard it and had not understood at the time what he was hearing. "Mike Delta 2-1, said Calloway. Bremner nodded slowly. "Mike Delta 2-1, very good, sir." He reached up. He touched the radio at his collar. He said 2 words into it that I did not hear. For a moment, nothing happened. The fog held. The gas lamps burned. Somewhere far off in the great courtyard, a horse stamped on stone. Then a door opened in the wall. I had walked past that wall every morning for 3 weeks. I had leaned against that wall while waiting for Pike to finish his cigarette. I had counted the bricks in that wall when I was bored. I had not known there was a door in it. The door opened inward. It opened smoothly and quietly. 3 men stepped out of it. They wore the working dress of the guard, and they moved without hurry, because they had been told there was no need to hurry, and they took up positions around the visitor in the way men take up positions when they have practiced it a great many times. The man called Calloway did not run. He did not shout. He did not reach for anything. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, and then opened them, and then he said very quietly, "May I sit down?" "You may," said Bremner. "Pike, the bench." Pike guided him to the bench beside the guardhouse wall, beside the document case. Calloway sat. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked at the cobblestones. Bremner picked up the document case. The kettle began to whistle inside the guardhouse. I took it off the gas. I did not pour the tea. Bremner brought the case inside. He set it on the table in the guardroom under the bear bowl. He did not open it yet. He stood looking at it for a moment, the way a man looks at something he has caught and does not yet wish to handle. Then he said without turning, "Reford." "Sergeant Major." "You did well, lad." "Sergeant Major, I didn't do anything." "You watched. That's a great deal of what the job is. Most of the rest is not doing the other thing." "The other thing, Sergeant Major." "Reacting." He turned then and looked at me properly for the first time in 3 weeks. He had pale gray eyes. and they were very tired and very calm. Reacting is what an amateur does, referee. A professional asks one more question. Remember that. I will, Sergeant Major. Now make the tea, 3 cups. The inspector from Thames Valley will be here in 8 minutes and he'll want 1. I made the tea. The case was opened later in the presence of the Thames Valley man and 2 officers from the Protection Command who arrived in an unmarked car at 7:20. I was permitted to stand at the back of the guardroom because Bremner said I had been present at the gate and the chain of custody required it. I did not entirely understand what that meant. I stood very straight against the wall and I watched. The brass locks clicked open. Inside the case there were 4 things. The first was a warrant car. It was a real warrant car. It belonged to a real Metropolitan Police inspector named Edward Calloway, who had reported it lost 6 months earlier when his coat had been taken from a restaurant cloakroom in Mayfair. The card had never been formally canceled in the Central Register because of a clerical oversight that would, in the weeks that followed, become the subject of a quiet internal review. The second was a uniform identification slip. It matched the uniform the man at the gate was wearing. The uniform had been stolen 3 weeks earlier from a dry cleaner in Pimlico, taken from a rack at the back of the shop during the lunch hour by a man who had walked in carrying a ticket stub and had walked out carrying someone else's coat. The dry cleaner had reported it. The report had reached a desk. The desk had not yet reached the right person. The third was a folded piece of paper. It had been folded many times and the creases were soft from handling. When the Thames Valley man opened it, it proved to be a hand-drawn map of the service corridors of the castle's east wing. The corridors were drawn from memory or from study. 3 rooms were marked with small crosses. A route was traced in pencil from the trade gate, up the service stair, along the corridor to the first of the crosses. The route avoided every position normally manned by a guard at that hour of the morning. The fourth was a small slip of paper, no larger than a calling card, tucked into the silk lining of the lid. On it, written in pencil in a very neat hand, was a single name. I knew the name. It was on the schedule pinned to the wall of the guardhouse. It belonged to a person who would be in one of those 3 rooms at 7:05 that morning, alone, for 14 minutes, before the morning's first appointment began. I will not write the name. It is not mine to give. It is enough to say that I read it and I understood, and I felt the cold come into my hands for the first time that morning, although I had been outside for hours. The Thames Valley man said, very quietly, Sergeant Major. Bremner said, I know. How did you? His boots. His boots. He'd never driven a police car in his life, polished like a guardsman on parade, no wear at the heel. The Thames Valley man looked at Bremner for a long moment. Then he said, 26 years. 26 years, said Bremner. You'll write it up. I'll write it up. I'd like a copy for our records. You'll have one by 10. The man called Calloway, whose real name we would learn at the trial, although I will not write that either was taken away in the unmarked car. He did not speak as they led him to it. He did not look back at the gate. He sat in the rear seat with his hands in his lap, in the same posture he had taken on the bench, and the car pulled away into the fog and was gone. Bremner sat down at the table in the guardroom. He took a sheet of paper from the drawer. He picked up a pen. He wrote the report in longhand. He wrote it slowly, the way he did everything, and when he had finished, he read it through once and made 2 small corrections and signed it at the bottom. Then he stood up. He put on his cap. He adjusted it in the small mirror by the door, although it did not need adjusting. He looked at me. Referred. Sergeant Major. Back on duty in 10 minutes. Sergeant Major. He walked out into the courtyard and back to the gate, and he took up his post, and the rest of the shift began. And by 8 o'clock, the delivery vans were coming in as they did every morning, and the kitchen lads were unloading crates of milk, and a young woman from the florist was arguing pleasantly with Pike about a wreath order, and the world went on as if nothing had happened. Because in a sense, nothing had. That was the point. I served at the trade gate for another 4 years. I served at other gates after that. I rose in time to wear stripes of my own, and I stood at other posts on other mornings in other weathers, watching other men approach out of other fogs. I learned to ask one more question. I learned the value of not reacting. I learned to notice boots and cuffs and the small motions of hands, and the way the truly dangerous men do not look dangerous at all. I am older now. I have grandchildren. I tell them very little about my work, because most of my work was a quiet thing, and a quiet thing does not make a good bedtime story. But once, a few years ago, a young clerk on his first month of duty stood beside me at a different gate on a different morning, and he had watched me turn a man away with 3 soft questions and a smile, and he asked me afterward how I had known. I thought for a long time before I answered. I thought about the fog at Windsor that morning, and the gas lamps and the robin on the post. I thought about Bremner's stillness and his cup of tea, and the bakery on Lupus Street that did not exist. I thought about the boots, polished to civilian standard, and the small folded map with the crosses on it, and the penciled name in the silk lining of the case. I thought about the door in the wall I had not known was a door. I thought about the fact that nothing had happened, and that nothing happening had been the entire point of 26 years of one man's service, and that the gate had held that morning because of a stillness so deep that even the man who came to break it had not seen it standing in front of him. And I gave the young clerk the only answer I have ever found that feels true. I said, the ones who keep the gate aren't the ones who stop the danger when it comes. They're the ones who notice it before it knows it's been seen. He nodded slowly. He did not quite understand. He would in time. The robin came back to the post that morning after the car was gone. I saw it through the guardhouse window while I was washing out the 3rd cup. It sat for a moment in the thinning fog. It looked at the gate. It looked at me. Then it flew away into the gray, and the gate stood, and the morning went on.